of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kriti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew. We'd love to go into Chicago. Tonight, President Trump taunting Democrats and escalating his warning about plans to deploy the National Guard into a new Democratic stronghold.
You try and reason with people like in Chicago with the governor and the mayor. You try and reason with them, and it's like you're talking to a wall. It must be an ideology that's just buried in their head and you can't do a damn thing about it. And we'd love to go into Chicago and straighten it out.
We'll talk to the former mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, about what the city can do to push back.
And French government in turmoil. The prime minister set to resign hours from now after losing a no-confidence motion over unpopular budget reforms. What this political crisis means for President Emmanuel Macron, who is now seeking a fifth prime minister in less than 2 years. Also, the message from the president to foreign companies after hundreds of South Korean workers are detained during an immigration raid at a Hyundai manufacturing plant in Georgia. And we have seen the letter that President Trump says does not exist from the so-called Epstein birthday book. Tonight, what Congress plans to do with it. And that is where we begin this evening as House Democrats release an alleged birthday note they claim Donald Trump sent to Jeffrey Epstein as part of a birthday book for Epstein. The note includes the message, "Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret," complete with a sketched outline of a woman's body and the alleged signature of Donald Trump, who was denied composing the message since it was first reported by the Wall Street Journal in July. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt issuing a statement on X, writing in part, "Latest piece published by the Wall Street Journal proves this entire birthday card story is false. As I have said all along, it's very clear President Trump did not draw this picture, and he did not sign it. President Trump's legal team will continue to aggressively pursue litigation." She writes later, "This is fake news to perpetuate the Democrat Epstein hoax." White House Deputy Chief of Staff Taylor Bodowich posting separately on X, "Time for News Corp to open that checkbook. It's not his signature. Defamation," referring to Wall Street Journal parent News Corporation. Here with more, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who was just editing this coverage in our newsroom a moment ago. Wendy, it's great to see you. News of the letter is not new.
Right.
Seeing the letter hits a little bit differently. The president is still standing by his guns here that it's not his.
Absolutely. He is standing by his guns that it's not his. The Wall Street Journal's analysis of the letter, since they broke the story initially, he said, look, that's not what Taylor Bodowich said was, look, that's not his signature, and here are some examples that look different. Yeah. Well, the Wall Street Journal has now found plenty of examples of letters he's written to people, including Hillary Clinton, ironically, in which he uses that same casual signature of just Donald. We don't know if he really wrote it, but we do know that it was given to the House Oversight Committee under subpoena from the Epstein estate. They had it in the birthday book. They turned it over to Congress, and Democrats today released that letter. So there would have to be a lot of jujitsu going on for that letter to be manufactured. Also, remember that House Republicans on the committee have seen it as well.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's the letter. And let's also just remember, to be fair, that when the Epstein victims had that news conference, I think it was last week, on the Capitol steps, they did say they didn't see Donald Trump do anything untoward or inappropriate when they saw him. But writing the birthday card, it looks, everything seems to point to the fact that Donald Trump did write that.
So what happens next here, Wendy? Where do we go from here in terms of the commentary from the White House or even the pressure from Congress?
Well, Congress seems to be keeping up the pressure, and it is bipartisan. Remember that we had Thomas Massie, who is a Republican who decided not to run again after opposing Trump on some legislative issues, is teamed up with Ro Khanna of California. And then, as I mentioned, those Epstein victims had that news conference last week. And they also talked to some members of Congress, and you have MAGA Republicans like Nancy Mace of South Carolina, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, coming out. Nancy Mace was in tears after listening to them. She has also publicly said she was a victim of sexual assault. And so their testimony hit her really hard. And so part of this, I think, is the MAGA conspiracy, that they believed there was more in the Epstein files. And, of course, they were looking for prominent Democrats. to be a part of it. And the Democrats have joined in since it became more Trump-focused. But, you know, I think the drumbeat isn't going to stop. And at some point, Mike Johnson is going to have to allow a vote on releasing everything. Well,
so how do you change the subject on a story like this? If you're President Trump, do you send troops to Chicago? In all seriousness, the threats that were out there all weekend, could this trigger a movement like that?
Absolutely it could, and I took you completely seriously at that. It's just the state we're in, that the answer to that might be that National Guard troops show up in Chicago. They have already started immigration raids in the city. Mm-hmm. That's probably not new that they've stepped up these immigration raids, but some of them seem more intense. Mm-hmm. And certainly Trump over the weekend talked nonstop about going into Chicago. And Tom Homan said on the Sunday shows that absolutely they were going in this week. So it does look like that's part of it. And as you know, Trump does like to change the narrative whenever it gets uncomfortable for him. So.
All right. Well, Wendy, it's great to have you with us.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson joining us now. Joining us now with more perspective on the story in Chicago, former Democratic Mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. Mayor, pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for your time today. We were just speaking with our reporter, Wendy, about the probability of the National Guard entering Chicago. From your perspective, what are the odds of that?
Look, it's impossible to know because as you have been following the story, every other day, Donald Trump says something completely different about whether he's going to send some folks in or not. Obviously, the decision of the judge last week in L.A., I think, was a significant setback. It's been very clear, though, that leaders here, not just the Democratic elected officials, but the business community has great concerns about sending in a National Guard and what that will do to Chicago. Right now, we are experiencing record lows in shootings and homicides. But let's be clear, this has nothing to do with violence. And we heard that from Donald Trump himself. The more he opens his mouth, the better the lawsuit will be against him. But this is clearly playing to his base, wanting to wave the flag of his power, his tyranny, his dominance. And it's really about ICE raids. It has nothing to do with violence in the city of Chicago. Look, he tried this in 2020. He went into Portland and almost destroyed the city entirely. And cities like Chicago, and I was mayor at the time, we sent him a letter, said, look, if you want to help on issues of violence, help us with the stream of illegal guns that pour into our city. Send us more prosecutors, send us more agents, set up interstate gun trafficking task forces. There are a number of things that the federal government is uniquely qualified to do if there's a seriousness of purpose about addressing gun violence. There's not. And so he's not talking about any of those things because it has nothing to do with violence. And I don't want to operate under the premise that, oh, we should send in a National Guard because Chicago's out of control. That's nonsense. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Mayor, about the way our mayor here in Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, has handled this situation, noting that the federal city is a very different situation legally than the city of Chicago. But she's decided to play a little bit of judo here and in fact, kind of move in the same direction as the president, thanking him for the help, saying, hey, you know what? Yeah, we like to have lower crime. But she's also found opportunities to draw lines, for instance, when he attempted to federalize the police department. How would you advise the current mayor of Chicago on working with, if I can use that expression, the administration in a way that might protect the people of Chicago?
Well, look, I'm going to pick up on the point that you made. Washington, D.C. is very, very different in terms of its relationship with the federal government than the city of Chicago, the city of Boston, Baltimore. Very, very different. And Muriel Bowser, who I consider a friend, I think really has to walk a very fine line. But let's start with the premise that the same people who want to come in and have sent the National Guard into D.C. cut the D.C. budget by $1 billion. She's got limited options, and I think she's playing the cards that she's been dealt very well, but it's a very different situation here. As I said before, we cooperate with the federal government on a regular basis, particularly our police department. For decades, Chicago police officers have been part of federal task forces, whether it's with the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, and so forth. That work continues. But what the difference is, you don't go into a place that doesn't want you. You don't go in and force resources that aren't needed. The federal government is uniquely qualified to do a number of things. It could be doing those things if there was a serious purpose about helping us address the illegal gun problem that we do have here in Chicago, because it's pouring over the border from other states, namely Indiana, Mississippi. The federal government could set up resources like task forces, like more prosecutors, like more agents, and expand the footprint of the ATF. But all you have to do is look at, this is not serious. They proposed to cut the budget of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms by 50%. They're cutting the number of agents. They're cutting the number of inspectors whose responsibility it is to hold these federal gun dealers responsible and make sure they're not selling to straw purchasers. You don't do all of those things if you're actually serious about addressing gun violence in a city like Chicago or anywhere across the country. We're not seeing that because this is not about violence. It's about exercise of power. It's about exercise of control. And frankly, the chaos and the threats is also part of it. People here in this city are scared. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And it's unfortunate and frankly shameful that the federal government is so cavalier, and particularly at the presidential level, who's got the largest bully pulpit of anyone in the world, to just blindly be saying, yeah, we're going to go in, we're going to do this. I'm sure you saw the social media post equating himself to the general in Apocalypse Now. I mean, this isn't a serious person.
Mayor Lightfoot, if we do get to that reality where you do see a National Guard enter Chicago, what can the city of Chicago actually do? Is there a scenario where we see two factions of law enforcement, one taking orders from the president, the other from the governor?
Well, my hope is that if the National Guard were to come, and I'm still holding out hope that that's not going to happen, but if the National Guard does come over the opposition of the governor and the mayor, I think the first thing that we're going to see is a lawsuit filed in federal court asking the court to stop the federal government from violating longstanding acts, namely the Posse Comitatus Act. You can't do this, and because there's no emergency, you can't militarize the National Guard against U.S. residents, U.S. citizens. There's no legal basis for that to happen. And as I said at the outset, the more the president talks and reveals his true motive in making these threats, the stronger the case gets against him to stop this from happening. I would also hope that if there's an action taken, there's coordination with the Chicago Police Department, the state police, and the other law enforcement that is routinely involved in law enforcement activities in the city of Chicago.
Well, it's good to have this conversation, Mayor. We'd like to stay in touch with you as this unfolds. The former mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, major political shakeup today in France, with the country's prime minister now set to resign after losing a no-confidence vote. We're live in Paris next with more on what's next for the French government, plus President Trump offering his last warning, as he put it, to Hamas. We'll dig into the options ahead with Evelyn Farkas, executive director of the McCain Institute. It's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kriti Gupta. Now, French Prime Minister Francois Bayrou lost a confidence motion in Parliament earlier today, forcing a third change in government in just over a year and reviving uncertainty over how the country can tackle its mounting debt burden. Burning the midnight oil. And joining us with the very latest, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who joins us from Paris. Ollie, walk us through where we go from here. Now that Francois Bayrou has lost this vote, what happens to the French government?
So this panned out sort of almost exactly as everyone had anticipated when this vote of confidence was called a couple of weeks ago by the French Prime Minister. Basically, almost immediately, every party in opposition said they would not get behind this budget, which was really sort of focused on cutting a lot of government spending, looking at social benefits, looking really across the board, and also raising some taxes. And within that, and today, his fate was sealed, and he will give his resignation to Emmanuel Macron tomorrow. And then Emmanuel Macron, the Elysee, has said that they will come up with a new prime minister in the coming days. The problem for that new prime minister is that they will be faced with the exact same parliamentary arithmetic that the last prime minister was and the prime minister before that was, which is basically a sort of paralysis here of fragmented European politics within France, where you have three basically identically sized blocks, many fractures even within those individual blocks, in order to try to present a budget in order to move things forward into 2026. And in his sort of opening remarks today, François Bayrou, as one of the sort of last speeches that he would make as the Prime Minister of France, he says, listen, you will vote today. You have the power to topple the government. What you do not have the power to do is ignore reality. And that reality is 51 years in France, half a century, where there has not been a balanced budget, where there's been a deficit for the last half century, a debt to GDP ratio, which is well above most of the EU countries, only two others that are below that. And that is the difficulty for France at a time when we know from Brussels to France, they're dealing with a much more hostile Washington, D.C. They're dealing with a massive slowdown, and there are massive structural reforms that are required at the EU level. And when you have the second biggest economy, a big supporter of the European Union, Emmanuel Macron, one of those pillars collapsing yet again, you have again the European project, not just France, severely weakened.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Paris. Oliver, thank you for all the great reporting today. President Trump is issuing what he is calling a final ultimatum to Hamas, posting to social media on Sunday, quote, "The Israelis have accepted my terms. It is time for Hamas to accept as well. I have warned Hamas about the consequences of not accepting. This is my last warning. There will not be another one, exclamation point," unquote. Joining us now for more analysis on this and other stories we're following, Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia and Ukraine in the Obama administration. What a treat to have you with us here in studio at the table. Unfortunately, another tough story to talk about, Evelyn.
Right.
And I'm wondering to what extent you believe this sort of ultimatum. We've talked about red lines and final warnings before.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Joe, I don't really see that anything radically has changed. Every time it seems like one side is ready to deal, the other side isn't. And to get Hamas to make a deal, you would really need all of the Gulf states arrayed. And the other thing I worry about is Israel, because we have it here. You know, our president said that Israel has said they will agree to the ceasefire. But do we know that from the Israeli government? And we've seen unofficial voices coming out of Israel saying that Netanyahu, that the Israeli government must take this opportunity. And that worries me a bit as well, because if the unofficial voices, you know, former defense ministers are coming out saying take the deal, maybe it's shaky in Israel as well.
Every iteration of the ceasefire negotiations, Hamas has come back and said, we'll agree to some of the hostage releases in exchange for completely eliminating the Israeli military presence when it comes to Gaza. Is there any reality where you can see a complete retreat of Israel out of Gaza?
No. I mean, you know, Kitty, you need to have the Israeli military there, at least for security purposes, until there's another security force, until there's a political resolution. So what Hamas is offering is really a no, because Israel is not going to remove its military. And frankly, Hamas needs to accept that it has no future militarily, that it has no future politically, and they're shockingly not there. I mean, they are letting their people be bombed to smithereens. Now, you can argue that the Israeli, government shouldn't be doing that, but Hamas is allowing it.
I want to ask you about another conflict, and the one that the president said he would solve on day one. What we saw last night in Ukraine, the greatest ever air assaults on Ukraine from Russia. This far into the war is an incredible superlative to roll out. 800 drones and 13 missiles going into the capital, hours-long attacks on residential areas. They hit government buildings. Should we assume that the overtures that President Trump made, including a full-blown summit in Alaska, are going nowhere?
They're going nowhere, Joe. And the thing is that there are two messages being sent here. One is to President Trump, like, we don't care. Yeah. We're actually continuing to bomb. And in fact, every time our president has had a conversation with Vladimir Putin, as the First Lady, according to the president, pointed out herself, there's been an increased barrage against the Ukrainian people. And President Trump has been very clear the killing has to stop. And so Vladimir Putin is saying, I'm in charge here, to our president. And he's making that same message to President Zelensky and to the world, frankly. And so I think the answer has to be to put more pressure on the Kremlin. Russia is the one that's in the way of peace. Now, I will say there's another message being telegraphed to people like us who follow the Kremlin. I think they're showing weakness. The fact that they feel like they have to pummel the Ukrainians in this moment, the fact that they are ramping up their activities, I don't think Vladimir Putin has a real plan for how to get out of this war.
Ahead of the Alaska summit, there was a real question of whether the Russian economy was losing money. The sanctions beat them down. The war machine was really losing a lot of fuel. Since then, there have been some serious partnerships with China and India, especially when it comes to their gas pipeline. Is that enough to sustain the war machine?
It might be, unfortunately. Only time can tell. I think if the Europeans put more pressure on Russia, and maybe the sanctions themselves are not going to be the solution. Realistically, Putin needs to be stopped in the battlefield. What does that mean? Increased arms, increased munitions to Ukraine. How do you get them those munitions? You unfreeze the assets that the Europeans have in their possession, 200 and something. It's close to $300 billion. That's a lot of money. They can buy a lot of equipment from the United States, from their own companies. Of course, they have to get it there quickly to Ukraine. But the way to convince Vladimir Putin to stop the war is to convince him that he can't win this war.
Well, the Secretary of Defense, I guess he goes as Secretary of War now, Pete Hegseth, was dealing with neither of these, at least in public today. He turned up in, of all places, Puerto Rico with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an unannounced trip to, of course, the very spot where we're going to be delivering 10 F-35 fighter jets to potentially manage what could be an ongoing conflict here with Venezuela. To what extent is this a breach of protocol of the secretary showing up like that in Puerto Rico, and what's it going to lead to?
Well, I worry about this, Joe, because first of all, the war on drugs, against illicit narcotics has been one that law enforcement has largely taken the lead on, and the military is used when necessary. But it's just like disaster relief. The military comes in when necessary. Why? Because our number one threats when it comes to military, adversaries are China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And we have to deter them. And if our Secretary of Defense, and I'm going to call him that because Congress has not changed the title, if our Secretary of Defense is paying attention to countering drugs in Latin America, he's not maybe paying enough attention to what's happening with China and Russia, Iran and North Korea. And again, those are the adversaries. We've heard, the Polish Prime Minister, I believe it was, recently said that he expects war with Russia. Now, he didn't say when. And, of course, we've heard these warnings also from the Baltic states. And Putin can, any day, if he wants to distract us, start some kind of, small aggression. It doesn't even have to be an outright invasion. And we have to be ready to deter it, to stop it. We don't want war with Russia.
All right. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute, joining us around the table, walking us through some of those dynamics. We thank you so much. Coming up on the program, stocks closing near an all-time high. We're going to get a check on today's market action next. We're watching Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
We think that the market priced at all-time highs is a function of the fact that 12-month forward earnings estimates are also at all-time highs. As long as forward earnings estimates continue to climb, we think the market is well supported.
The Fed's going to cut 25 basis points in September, and it won't be enough. And then they're going to cut 25 basis points in the next meeting, and it won't be enough. It's not going to be enough to satisfy the president that wants immediate, drastic cuts.
The jobs market is not as lagging an indicator as some like to think it is. The jobs slowdown is an alarm bell for me.
Just some of the expert voices from this morning on Bloomberg surveillance. For a closer look now at the markets on this Monday, we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, a lot of focus right now on interest rates, the economy, and of course the Fed and how it all ties together. You can take a look at the chart on the screen over my shoulder here, the drop in the 2-year yield on the day. But quite frankly, it's been on a downtrend since at least August 22nd. That was the date that Jay Powell gave that speech at Jackson Hole, his most definitive statement about the possibility, the near and almost sure possibility that the Fed will cut rates in September. And now the bet is that those rate cuts will continue. I want you to take a look at what's been going on with the 30-year yield, because that's actually been rising over the last few days and weeks. However, that dropped precipitously today, and for one big reason: a bet by the markets right now that maybe potentially inflation could be capped. Remember, the longer-term yields would typically rise because of concerns about inflation. The idea now that they've started to fall, including today, and falling more than the 2-year, seems to be a sign, a mix, that a weak labor market, potential rate cuts by the Fed will keep a lid on inflation. And of course, we are going to get a read on inflation, Joe and Creedy, just over the next few days, on Wednesday with wholesale inflation, and then of course on Thursday when it comes to consumer inflation, that CPI number.
Romaine, lower yields, a rate cut, that should be fuel for the stock market to go even higher. Why does JP Morgan's trading desk think that's not how it works this time around?
Well, it's sort of that, what do you call it? Buy the rumor, sell the news types of thing. Look, there's no one in this market right now that has priced in the possibility of no rate cut come next week. That means that everybody is basically anticipating we're going to get 25 basis points, maybe even a full half a percentage point cut at that September 17th rate decision. So the idea is that if they make good on that 25 basis points, maybe you did get a bit of a sell-off. In fact, Sarah Malik over at Nuveen was on my program a little bit earlier and said just that. I do want to point out, though, Creedy, we did see a lot of strength today in the technology space. And this seems to be where a lot of people are putting their bets, not only for the growth story in that space, Joe and Creedy, but the idea here that it also acts as maybe a potential defensive hedge. The high-flying companies out there that continue to deliver. And, of course, this is a story about AI, but it actually feeds into what's going on in Washington and what's going on with the economic data. Microsoft continued, while it didn't have a huge movement on the day, it continues to be one of the leaders in that space. We're going to get Oracle earnings later this week. Of course, a big builder of data centers. And just after market today, at the bottom of your screen, you're looking at the change in a company that we don't talk about. It's called Nebius. This is basically a Russian company that was kind of spun off of Yandex a little while ago. It's backed by NVIDIA. NVIDIA took a big investment in it. And we just learned today that Microsoft is going to give this company a contract of roughly $17 to $19 billion over the course of 5 years to help Microsoft build out that data center that it had promised to the administration in New Jersey. It looks like, at least based on this contract, that is moving forward. And you see the move in the shares. This was a company that traded at less than $30 a share at the start of the year. It closed in the $60 range earlier today in the after-hour session, crossing the $100 mark.
Big moves, dare I say, power moves, helping us connect the dots to Wall Street every day. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Thank you so much, Romaine. There's a deluge, as Romaine just mentioned, of economic data coming this week. He already mentioned a couple of these data points, and our next guest says the numbers will likely reflect the economy is moving in the wrong direction. Liz Pancotti is Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Groundwork Collaborative and joins us now in studio. It's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Coming off Friday's jobs report, paints a pretty ugly picture here when you step back and look at the composite. Should Jay Powell have been cutting already?
I think that the issue with whether the Fed should have been cutting or whether the Fed shouldn't have been cutting is we've been seeing a real decline in the labor market over the last 6 months or so. Mm-hmm. I expect revisions tomorrow will show that decline started a little bit before, Donald Trump took office. We'll get revisions through March of 2025. I think the issue that Jay Powell faces, and I think that they are trying to grapple with this over the next week as they decide what to do with interest rate cuts, is the Fed has one blunt instrument that they can adjust. Yeah. It is simply the Fed funds rate. And when you are staring down the barrel of higher inflation, I expect that we'll see a high CPI and PPI print later this week and a declining labor market. You have to pick which baby you drown, right? You have to pick which one you're going to affect worse. Wow. And unfortunately, that's the position they're in. Yeah. I don't envy the position Jay Powell and the Fed have been in over the last few months, and I don't think it's going to be any easier with the data we get over the next few days.
Well, the tool of interest rate cuts are absolutely blunt, but an argument that's been made on on Capitol Hill and certainly from the White House is that cuts equal a benefit to housing. It makes housing more affordable. Is there a world where if you have a steeper long end of the curve, that housing actually gets more expensive even as you cut rates?
I think the issue in the housing market in particular is one of a labor story. You are already having home builders and construction companies around the country saying they are having extreme difficulties filling those spots right now on their job sites given the immigration concerns. And it is one of tariffs. Building materials are more expensive. And as construction companies, as home builders, as even home buyers, look, they cannot make the math pencil out at current interest rates or even 50 basis points of an interest rate lower given the other pressures facing the housing market.
Well, you just said an awfully important word for tomorrow, and that's revisions. What are we in for here, and who's going to get fired?
Well, I don't know who's left in the Department of Labor.
You know what I'm
building
talking
to
about,
fire.
though. Donald Trump's going to be posting like mad tomorrow, right? Because this may not be good news.
No, and I mean, this is the exact same timing that President Biden faced last year, just before the election. There was an 800,000 job revision. At that point, I suspect we'll see a number around there tomorrow. I heard Anna on the show earlier talking about how Bloomberg is edging that down a little bit, and I saw out from Goldman this morning, they're expecting about 800,000, but everyone's cautioning that data too might be revised later, given so much of the job growth over the past year has been driven by the healthcare industry, which is on shaky ground. The immigration story, obviously. I could see a scenario tomorrow where we are looking at something between 5 and 800K, which is, I think, broadly consensus. We might see that further revised up or down in the coming months as all of this gets taken care of. And given the Hill delaying E.G. Antoni's hearing this week, I'm not sure President Trump will be very happy with the folks over at the Francis Perkins building.
So when we spoke to Anna Wong, she said that this particular data set that we've just gotten might have some seasonal kind of altercations or elements to it as well. There's an argument here that if you do see kind of this element of all of the revisions, a lot of that overlaid with the kind of unclarity or lack of clarity that you saw on the tariff front. Explore the hypothetical with me. If the tariffs are now clear, we have these numbers, we have a good chunk of the trade deal cemented, does that hiring freeze, pause, the kind of the numbers that would have slowed that hiring, is that really does that apply in the next 6 months the way that it did in the last 6?
I think the revisions are less of the question as we look at the paralysis in the labor market, right? The revisions from June that we got last week actually showed a negative jobs print in June for the first time since the last month of President Trump's first term in December 2020. Right now, 27% of people who are unemployed have been so for more than 6 months. We are seeing negative manufacturing job growth, given, even though the president is promising a manufacturing renaissance, all of our job growth right now is being driven by the healthcare sector. And if you exclude healthcare, you have actually seen a loss of 140,000 jobs over the last 6 months. All of this should be flashing alarm bells as the Fed carefully considers what to do next week, but also as policymakers consider what to do. Right now, as a result of President Trump's handling of the economy, the business sector, the private sector, and the public sector is not looking good for the labor market.
The fact is, though, and the administration reminds us of this, that we haven't seen the impact of tariffs come through on consumer side retail inflation, CPI. Got a little spooked with the PPI a month ago. And the idea is you guys have been saying this every month since we got in the door. Well, guess what? It hasn't happened. When do you see it happening?
I mean, I expect, and I know consensus forecast is a 2.9% inflation rating. That is the highest it has been in many, many months. It's not moving down, right? That will not be the first increase we've seen in the last few months. And so I think the story that I think squares this picture, we've been listening to a lot of earnings call data, so we're taking it directly from Wall Street and from the C-suite, is that large firms were able to hold inventories of about 4 to 6 months of stuff to put on the shelves. Liberation Day tariffs were paused. They are now in effect with some trade agreements, though I wouldn't say there's a ton of certainty. They are really not inked in full. And now companies are having to put things on the shelves, or they will very soon start to put things on the shelves that were tariffed. I think that as we head into the holiday season, families are in for a real crunch. And in those CPI prints and on the sticker prices that you and our families are paying on the shelves, we will start to see those price increases at the same time the labor market further deteriorates.
Oof.
A grim picture, absolutely, when it comes to the U.S. labor market. Liz Pancotti, Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at Groundwork Collaborative, joining us on the program to walk us through some of those numbers. Coming up, President Trump says foreign companies must respect U.S. immigration laws after a major ICE raid in Georgia threatens relations with top trading partners. Details ahead, plus reaction from our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
People that are in this country illegally need to know right now today that they have an opportunity to go home before they are detained. So many of those individuals that were detained through that operation in Georgia, we are following the law. They are going to be deported. A few of those had criminal activity beyond just being here past final removal orders, and they will face the consequences for that.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kriti Gupta. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. That was Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem speaking earlier today, answering a question over a raid last Thursday we told you about at the construction site of a Hyundai EV battery plant in Georgia. More than 300 of the 476 workers detained were South Korean. Bloomberg News reporting the sweeping raid shocked South Koreans after images showed workers shackled at the wrists, waists, and ankles. It came less than 2 weeks after Lee Jae-myung and Donald Trump held their summit to underscore their alliance. The raids rattling the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea and causing some investors to reconsider future investments. During a government meeting today, South Korea's trade minister said, "We are well aware of the concerns that have been raised regarding our investment in the U.S. following the immigration crackdown. We will work with related agencies, including the Foreign Ministry, to explore ways to improve the system." Here with more, Bloomberg Economics' Mike Sasso, who joins us from our Atlanta bureau. Mike, what's going to end up, first of all, happening to these South Koreans who thought they were coming here to do a job?
Yeah, well, my understanding is they're set to be sent back to Korea, I believe on Wednesday. Is my understanding that there was a deal so that they would actually formally go back voluntarily as opposed to go through the, quote, deportation process. The reason that might be advantageous is if they were formally deported, there might be some restrictions on them coming back to the U.S. And my understanding is that going back voluntarily may limit some of those restrictions on coming back.
Mike, just walk us through kind of the diplomatic aftermath of this particular incident. The fact that the South Koreans had to get involved in a trade investment, basically, that they had made. Where do we go from here?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. It particularly puts the state of Georgia and Governor Brian Kemp a little bit on the hot seat. Korea has been a big trading partner with the state of Georgia. In fact, there was a new $500 million deal across the state in Columbus involving Korea and some rare earths over on the other side of the state. And of course, I believe there was some mammoth $350 billion trade deal just struck between Korea and the United States. And so my sense is that they'll all work it out, and I know they're working furiously to try to make sure this doesn't blow up into something that kind of takes down this deal.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Sasso joining us from Atlanta. We thank you so much walking us through the story at the Hyundai plant. Let's get a little bit more analysis on this evening's political panel. Bloomberg political contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, joins us right here in studio, Republican strategist there, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Democracy, I'm going to get my words right, visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Ash Center. We thank you so much. Rick, I'm going to come to you first on the story with the plant and the Hyundai immigration raids that we saw. If you are a foreign country looking to invest in the United States and you see a story like that, what would reassure you?
Well, I'm not sure anything in this story is going to be reassuring. I mean, take South Korea, for instance. They've made all these huge commitments, almost $1 trillion worth of, public commitments to invest in the United States. And here we are going through this charade, and this is a charade. ICE shows up. This has been a sanctioned project. Mm-hmm. We have South Korean workers building this plant. They put them in shackles only to release them to go home so they can turn around and come back and continue working on the same plant. I mean, if you're a South Korean policymaker, you're wondering, what is going on in the United States? Yeah. Why would they interrupt the flow of activity? Why would they slap around an investor who just made almost $1 trillion commitment? So, yeah, it's going to create a lot of questions, and this White House needs to get ahead of it, and it's not going to be good enough to have the head of Homeland Security saying some of them had records.
Yeah, right. So what is going on here, Jeannie, if nothing more than President Trump arguing with himself?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about arguing with himself. It's a huge contradiction between his immigration policy and his economic policy. And of course, he should be very focused on the economic end of things, giving the dire picture that we are looking forward to. And you were both just talking about with your guest in the last segment. So, you know, President Trump has invested an enormous amount in Tom Homan, in ICE, which now has a budget larger than the Israeli military, and they are using it. And to Rick's point, this seems very performative. To what end? And so this is where they're going to have to really think about how they get their ducks in a row and move forward. They are not rowing in the same direction, and that would probably explain a little bit of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's frustration over the last week.
Well, Jeannie, critics of, or I should say supporters of the Trump administration, what's going on here with these immigration raids would say it's not the president, it's actually the visa process. What would you say to that?
Well, I think they're right. It is the visa process, but it is the president of the United States who has to fix that process. And I think that is exactly the right thing to focus on. A lot of these people, and the Korean press has been talking about this, the system is broken. It is very hard to get visas extended. When you change a role at a company, you have to go in and out in a certain number of days. The system has long been broken. That's where the money that's gone to ICE should go. It should go to fixing a process that is problematic, because we need to both grow the economy and, of course, allow people to respect the laws of the country.
Rick and Jeannie, the letter has been made public. I'm referring to the letter that Donald Trump said did not exist and said that he did not create as part of a note in a birthday book to Jeffrey Epstein. This is a story that broke in the Wall Street Journal shortly before we came to air. It has since been matched by Bloomberg News. There it is if you're with us on Bloomberg Television or on YouTube, a note complete with an outline that looks like it was drawn in magic marker of a woman's body, signed Donald. Now, the White House has been very serious about this, pushing back on what was released by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. They got their hands on this document from the Epstein estate, we're told, and have made it public. Crisis management time. Rick Davis. Donald Trump says he wasn't part of this. The White House has reminded us of that since, and this is why he's suing News Corp, or at least has threatened to sue News Corp. What does it mean when you have a document land that gets the whole story going again?
Well, and this document's been in the files for decades, right? Mm-hmm. This isn't something that somebody claims he just did. They claim he did it when they were pals.
Years ago.
He and Jeffrey Epstein. And so, one, it reminds you completely of a relationship that you're trying to now deny and try and paint as, you know, well, I cast him out of my life decades ago. Well, at one point in time, you were friends. I think they're following the Roy Cohn script, right? This is a famous lawyer in New York who taught Donald Trump a lot about crisis management. Deny, deny, deny. Mm-hmm. That's a strategy. They're going to stick with that. There's no chance Donald Trump is going to wake up tomorrow and say, hey, you know, I shouldn't have drawn that picture.
Okay.
Jeannie, weigh in here. For a mainstream audience, does seeing this letter solidify the relationship between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein?
You know, I think there's probably very few people in the country or the world, quite frankly, who believe that when he denies it, he really didn't draw it and he really wasn't friends. I mean, he's admitted there was a relationship and then they had a falling out. I know what Rick is talking about with the Roy Cohn deny, deny, deny. This was apparently before he was arrested. It was 2003. He was arrested in 2006. I think he'll continue to deny. He filed this big lawsuit against this big case against the Wall Street Journal for reporting it, but I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. I think Donald Trump was right initially when he said, release the files. Now that he's saying don't release the files, or the DOJ is, I think he's gotten himself into a heap of trouble. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, the New York Times had a big story today on J.P. Morgan's complicity in this entire Epstein saga. So there is a lot of blame to go around for big institutions and wealthy individuals. But I think Donald Trump would be on the right side of history and do right by these victims to say, release these files. They've suffered long enough.
The president has called it a Democrat hoax, and the press secretary used that language again today as well. You've got a couple Republicans on that discharge petition, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, who presumably the president is still close with. But what does that mean when you have victims of assault in this case, holding a news conference in Washington, meeting with lawmakers, while the president on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue refers to them as a hoax?
Yeah, this has become a horrible embarrassment for the Republican Party. One, because we don't have a unified message, right? The Hill wants answers. Yeah. Republicans, chairman of these committees, talk big about how they want to uncover the truth, except when it comes to the White House, they're like, bury it, right? This is a Democratic hoax, and we don't want to see any of this. And right in the middle of this is the Attorney General, who has made a living off of creating all these Epstein stories, is now claiming, oh, my gosh, there's nothing there. Don't look in this direction. So we're tripping over ourselves. Democrats can just stand back and watch the action. It's absolutely a flammable thing for them, because it's not that we're going to win, Democrats are going to win Republican votes, but if our Republicans stay home in the midterms because they've lost faith in us, it could have a dramatic impact on the outcome of the elections.
Well, just quickly, are you surprised, and if not, why, that this discharge petition doesn't have the votes to bring it to the floor yet?
Yeah, I'm actually shocked that it doesn't have the votes.
Is Donald Trump working the phones?
Oh, absolutely. We know from reporting that he's put people on the phone and said, you know, don't sign the discharge petition. Wow. I mean, he does not want to see this go any further than it's already gone. He would love it just to go away, which is the antithesis of what everybody in the Republican Party was saying a year ago.
Jeannie, in the last about 30 seconds that we have, what kind of policy response should we be expecting from this? If Donald Trump doesn't want the attention on the Epstein files, what does he do?
You know, like my mother used to say, rip off the Band-Aid fast. That's what lawyers say as well. That's what he should have done. That's what he should do. They left town, as you know, back in the summer to try to avoid it, and it's back in full. So they've got to rip the Band-Aid off, release the files, and get this done with, and focus on the economy, which is the policy issue that we need to be addressing, number one.
We're going to be rolling into Chicago tomorrow, Jeannie. Only got 30 seconds.
Oh, gosh, I think so. They've already got a name for this operation, and I think that they are getting exactly what they want. They're probably going to see protests, and that will give them what they need to call out the National Guard. They're calling it the L.A. The L.A. sort of is the framework for what they're going to try to do in Chicago and probably Boston and maybe New York, where I am pretty soon.
Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, we thank you, as always, for the insights and analysis. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power alongside Preeti Gupta. I'm Joe Matthew.